All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 131 today, Exogenesis with Bruce and Daniella Fenton. And I just want to say Maurice is off today. I'm going to be conducting this interview alone. Everybody stay safe out there. It's crazy, and everybody just love each other, okay? I just want to say that. I just want everybody, love thy neighbor. I know it's a commandment. A lot of people aren't religious, but I think that that's a good way to start with all this is just love thy neighbor. Let's go from there. Just be peaceful and loving, and let's start each day that way and go from there. But I'm not gonna pontificate. Let's get on with the show. This is Mind Escape. So Bruce, welcome back. We had you on not that long ago, and welcome Daniella for the first time, and we are glad to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you having us on.
Yeah, thank you for having us on.
No problem. So you just recently came out with a new book. It got released a few days ago, and it's called Exogenesis Hybrid Humans. The foreword was written by Eric von Daniken, and for anybody that's not familiar, they can go back and watch the other episodes we've done with you. The last one we did was on ancient aliens and Gnosticism, and then the first one we talked about your into Africa theory and your theory of evolution, what you think went down. But this is a whole kind of a completely different end of the spectrum here. So why don't you give us a little bit of your hypothesis with these hybrid humans and these ancient aliens?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the book's I think I'd call it fairly wide-ranging, that we tackle at the core an ancient alien story, but it also begins with a bit of a look at the modern incidents that have obviously reverberated around the media with the Navy incidents. Take a look at that. We discuss SETI, and the way that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence has functioned over the years, not just necessarily now. Also, all sorts of things from contact events, the experience of alien abductions that people purportedly have. That's in there. But then, at the very core is the idea that we have been visited in the very remote past, and that there has been manipulation of the genome. So it's both modern and ancient phenomena kind of mixed in together there within the boundaries of the project.
Yeah, so the part of your hypothesis about you think that this happened sometime 780,000 years ago? Is that the
yes? Yeah, that's the main event, if you like. That's what I would posit as being the engineering of the ancestors of Homo sapiens. Now, I don't preclude that there hasn't been other events, both earlier and after. And indeed, I touch on very briefly the idea that I think there is some suggestive evidence of other modifications, but the strongest evidence points to this event at 780.
Yeah, that's. The weird thing is, didn't they just find some sort of impact event that happened around that same time?
Yeah, they did actually. Yes, yeah. I can go into that a bit if you like.
Yeah, so
that's kind of relevant. Mm-hmm.
So before we get into that, though, why don't you just give us what was the? I know you've been kind of on this hypothesis for a little bit now, but what was the catalyst for doing this book the way you did it, and where do you think that this is going? Do you have future plans to try and find more physical evidence, or is this something that you just kind of go with the flow and see what comes out of it?
Yeah, I mean, it came out of a mixture of the experiences and the research we were doing ourselves, but then that connected us to researchers over in Australia and a lady who had some experiences that provided the information, Lady Valerie Barrow, and her book Outer Ring, When the First Ancestors Were Created, which ended up being kind of a source, as kind of almost a guiding map of information to find some of the evidence. So that came out of a chain of events really, where we'd had our own experiences, some kind of contact type experiences. Was also I was researching some ancient mysteries that pointed to humans coming out of Australia, and obviously we've tackled that in our conversation about the Forgotten Exodus, my previous work. And so it really, that flowed into it in a kind of strange way, because it was through that I connected with these other other people in Australia, and then found out about this book, and then ended up realizing that there were elements of the story in that book which then meshed not only with our personal, I guess, knowledge and experiences, but particularly with an event I had back in 2003, which was during a sort of shamanic, altered state kind of journey that I had an experience where I did see, I guess you can say remote viewing, whatever, bit of past life, I don't know what you call it, but I saw a craft, coming to Earth, and I had the sense that there'd been this event, explosion of this alien craft. And so it was really weird, because I found that then that was actually discussed in Valerie's book, the idea that this had happened. So on a personal level, you could say it was a metaphysical, spiritual event that kind of compelled me to take her account more seriously. Now, I guess the average person would just be like, well, that's so much strangeness and woo. But the way I've looked at that is, that's fine to have strangeness. And like, to be honest, we all, if you have any kind of metaphysical view or religion, obviously there's a degree of strangeness in it. Right. So it's not exactly uncommon to take seriously some strangeness. But what I wanted to do was, of course, was also to provide some substantiating evidence, because otherwise to me, it's not worth writing a whole book to repeat something that someone else has already said. You know what I mean? If otherwise I would just say, read Valerie's book, make of it what you will.
Right.
Instead, I thought, well, look, could I find evidence that would really back up the central claims in it? And that's kind of how the project got going, was the idea that if this was genuinely a real kind of download of information from a, non-human intelligence, that, then the way to prove that is to find substantiating objective evidence, that would mesh with the story. And that's kind of really what it was. That's the project in a summary, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find your work interesting because you try, you take an approach that's, look, let's face it, we're both, interested in the UFO and UAP phenomena and ancient aliens. And while I don't believe any aliens actually built any ancient civilizations or megalithic structures, that when you look at, like we talked about this last time, stories from the Bible, shamanic experiences, people having psychedelic DMT experiences and encountering aliens, I think it makes a little bit more sense when you come at it from that kind of a microscope, and you're just getting in there and you're looking at all these moving parts. As somebody that has done psychedelics, I'll ask Daniella this: do you think that there is something to that with the connection between aliens and psychedelics or altered states, or do you think that that's ourselves talking to ourselves, maybe subconsciously? What do you think's going on there?
I think psychedelics opens the gateway in a way. And when you take certain psychedelics, it's said in shamanic thinking that it stays with you for the rest of your life. So it leaves you open, I guess, to experiences. Shamanism in general can have a very close tie, interweaving with contact with beings from other places, whether it be alien, our own consciousness, us in the future, us in the past, going around in different cycles, revisiting ourselves. That's all very closely tied together. So, I mean, in sense of psychedelics and the, alien experience overall, I do believe that it's very closely linked. And for people that do psychedelics, I think they don't necessarily have to do psychedelics to have the experience, to have the contact. But for the ones that do, they probably have more of an intense, I guess, experience. And there is a lot of accounts of shamanic experiences where, people have been in, different places out in the open or in the jungle or in, forest, and they've seen a lot of things. So it does, I think, thin the veil very, very, very much. And so it allows an interchange between anything that, is out there that wants to make contact in an easy way and just give us a download of information or participate in what we're doing here. So it is an opening of, the channel so that can happen. It does facilitate it. I do believe that, it's very closely related. If not, it is part of shamanism, really.
Right. Do you think it could be something like you mentioned, opening up like a channel kind of a thing? Do you think that maybe through I meditate a lot, and once I started to meditate, if you meditate and then fall asleep, you almost instantly go, or at least I do, it induces lucid dreaming. So do you think it could be that psychedelics maybe open up that gateway where now you're aware of this other thing and you can kind of play off of that as well as receive, vibration or message or whatever the case may be?
Well, yeah, I mean, with meditation, you're opening up your spirit really, and you're sort of like letting go of the physical. So I think that when you do that, you're more in tune with whatever is receptive to you, that we don't see. And then, it can facilitate our experiences that way, because it's like letting loose the spirit or the soul, to connect and to tap in to other sources and frequencies. So yeah, definitely has, I guess it is a way of opening a door with meditation also, or just, being in that conscious state where you're relaxed and you're not so earthbound.
Right.
So I think that's one of probably the bigger hints, what meditation can be used for that.
Some of the, I was going to say, some of the experiences people describe as well, sound very much on the borders of a lucid dream. I theorize myself that there's a state, that exists between lucid dreaming and, full wakefulness, that there's something in the between where you're awake but dreaming, sort of dreaming awake, where if you look at some of the UFO encounters and other experiences, they describe this sort of being out of space and time, but that, you're still where you were,
right.
But there's a sense of no longer being there, and that all the noises have stopped, and almost like you've gone into another reality within that same space, which almost sounds a bit like a kind of the brain in a state of, somewhere between lucid dreaming and full awakeness. Now, I don't know if there's a recognized brain state for that or not, but it definitely, to me, I suspect there's something that's not far off from the lucid dreaming experience, that's involved in a lot of this contact stuff.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. And I had a conversation with one of my buddies yesterday, and we were going back and forth, and we were talking about like meditating, and I said the longest I've ever meditated actively without falling asleep was probably 3 hours. And when I came out of it, I felt like an alien. Everything felt foreign, even though I was in my own house. It was just a really weird experience. It's like, and there was a calmness, like a serenity that I had that I've never experienced in any other waking state. So I think that there is something to that. I don't know. Obviously, I know everybody's different, and I know there's a lot of people that try and meditate that don't have success. Maybe they're too ADD, or maybe they just don't have the focus or patience. But I think that's something that you learn and cultivate over time too. So people that you don't let the first couple times, deter you from continuing that. I think you have to keep pushing through until you get to the point where you can just jump right in. Bruce, now you, like I mentioned, Graham Hancock wrote the foreword to your first book, Into Africa. Eric von Daniken wrote the foreword to this book. Have you ever met him, or is this just something that you guys went back and forth about?
Graham I've met at a couple of different events. Only know in that context, having been to events where he was speaking and stuff. So physically I've met him. Eric I have not physically met. It's just a connection was through our agent, who does know him quite well. And so he was able to, establish that situation where Eric was able to do the forward. So that was really cool. So I didn't have a direct correspondence with him on that. I would like to have. It'd be nice in the future if I could maybe get a chance to physically thank him, to go up to him and say thanks for doing that, and to have a chat. Definitely. I mean,
no, it's for sure. I mean, do you think that the whole Ancient Alien thing? Obviously, you've been on Ancient Aliens on History Channel, and it's kind of like a I don't know. I love Ancient Aliens, but then there's some things I'm like, oh, why are you doing that? But at the same time, they have other things where it's like, that's a credible, they're panspermia episodes. They're, so it's kind of like a mixed bag in that regard.
Definitely. Yeah.
When you, going forward, do you think that these things should be talked about in terms of let's weed out the BS, or do you think just allow that to happen? Or let the people decide that, and just, it's entertainment, but some people might, what do you think about that whole topic?
Well, I think one thing that would be helpful, and again, I don't know why exactly this hasn't happened, would have been as if History Channel had created a second show, almost like a spin-off, with doing the Lost Civilizations, because at the moment, see the Lost Civilizations and some of the ancient mysteries that would be better suited to a non-aliens approach. They get kind of lumbered into the show, and I mean, and that's fine. It's still interesting, but I definitely think there's topics in there which would suit, a separate kind of, we have an ancient alien show and also a ancient lost civilization show. You know what I mean? That would have, I think, would have worked better, because then you're not having to, in some episodes where you have to kind of make a convoluted argument to put what would seem to be lost civilizations constructions or something into an alien context, right? Because it's an interesting site or an interesting story that's associated with it, but not necessarily very convincingly alien. And they would be better off in a kind of a spin-off. And so I don't know. I'd hope to see that they do that at some point. And I know that I'm sure you'd like that. And a lot of researchers who are involved in that topic would, I'm sure, be happy to go on such a show. I don't know why that hasn't happened. That's my kind of thoughts on it. Is that because sometimes the topics they're interesting, but I do think that there's ones where you think, well, that would have been better off in a a lost civilizations, ancient mystery show.
Right. Yeah. Well, they turned God of the Gaps into Alien of the Gaps, right? I mean, that's kind of what the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously that definitely happens. I mean, so yeah, I think that, and then like you said, there's other episodes which obviously are very strong. Which
I've seen panspermia episodes where there's like legitimate scientists on where they're talking about the real aspects of the panspermia, hypothesis. It's just like I said, I think that you made a good point, and I do think that they should do that. Why not have two shows? They would be both very successful because people love the megalithic sites all over the world, and most people don't get to see them. I mean, that's how I was introduced to Göbekli Tepe. I didn't learn about that in high school or college, or that wasn't something that, even though I was in high school and college in the 2000s, we were still talking about like the basic history of the world. There was no new finds or cool new megalithic structures that just got unearthed or anything like that. So I think that people love that stuff, so why not have more of that out there? I don't understand.
Exactly, yeah. And if they need the equivalent of a Giorgio that heads it up, I'm available. They just have to they just have to give me a shout and let me know.
You're a walking atlas, encyclopedia, dictionary, and know-it-all.
I can jump in on that one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, you get people like you get people like Graham Hancock. You can get all the ancient civilization. I hate to call it that, but that's what it is fringe researchers, because the mainstream is not accepting of anything that's not the formal paradigm. So
that's right. So there'll be plenty of people to do that. So I mean, maybe that'll happen in the future. But I have to say, I'm quite pleased with the episodes I've been featured on so far, which is I think about 4. Have been, I liked them. I'd say there was a couple of ones where I've learned a couple of things. I mean, there was the Alien Mountain, which is a site in Italy, which, to be honest, I'd never heard of before they contacted me, and then had a bit of a dive into it, and it is quite fascinating. Again, it's one of those ones which is a crossover because it does have a link to UFO sightings and things like that, but at the same time it very clearly links to stories of a lost civilization. So I mean, obviously there are crossover stories, and in those, again, you'd think you'd have 2 shows which look at the same site from different perspectives, really, because I mean, that one, it turns out there was a link back to a druid city that may have been destroyed by a flood, and really, it was really quite fascinating. And then the other ones, I've done a couple which have been related to the Pleiadian kind of connection, which is really good because, of course, my book does tackle that. I mean, that it was kind of, I guess, nice that I ended up in a couple of shows which were, I guess you say, hyper relevant.
Yeah, the one book. Which one I thought it was the one, the Hawaiian one where you were talking, but you were talking about like Lemuria and a couple other things on there. Yeah,
the Islands of Fire. I personally didn't really, as you might have noticed, I didn't personally talk about Lemuria because I'm skeptical of the Lemuria kind of side of it.
Yeah, I mean, other than listening to Rudolf Steiner talk about it a little bit, I don't really. I haven't really entertained it that much. Like, I think Atlantis, if you're gonna go hypothetical lost civilizations, I think Atlantis has a lot more evidence to suggest that it probably was a real ancient, widespread civilization at some point.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion when you have topics like that, you're better off just saying, either a flooded land or a lost civilization, because unless you definitively have an ancient name that's been passed down, or a local culture definitely is using that name for some period, hasn't been influenced by modern sources, then I don't see the gain in using a term which probably didn't exist, 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. I think that just muddies the waters, because if I start saying it's called Lemuria and I've got no source that doesn't go back more than a couple of hundred years, then why is it called Lemuria? If it was there 5,000 years ago and the name has appeared recently,
Right.
then it wouldn't have been called Lemuria. So those were I was sort of where I didn't personally talk about there being a Lemuria there, but it was a good episode to be in. Certainly there was other aspects I was quite happy to talk about. The Hawaiian gods and their possible link to extraterrestrial visitation, and the fact that the Hawaiians have legends that suggest to that, including sort of creation stories that sound like they are relating to contact. So obviously there's always elements. You look into local lore, that's where you often do find stories that are to do with contact events and stuff, and that's really cool. You get the local legends of the gods or visitations and stuff,
right?
Which for me is fine. The other side of it, I left to other people that have those opinions. And that's a good thing about the show, though, to you're is that you're not forced to kind of say, come on, we really need you to say, I think Lemuria was an alien spaceship. There's nothing like that. It just
they do an interview, right? And then they take the parts that they want to feed into the episode, right? And
absolutely,
it's still you talking about it. It's just they took part of the whole thing you did, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm there for a couple of hours answering questions for probably 3 or 4 episodes. So there's a lot of actual, B-roll somewhere,
right,
of me answering all kinds of questions. So and then they just select from that the little bit that they think fits.
Now, that being said, though, I will say this: Maurice and I put together a slideshow and did research on Easter Island and talking about the mainstream paradigm or the mainstream hypothesis of what happened versus the alternative hypotheses. And then doing that, I noticed there are features that almost look like land bridges. If you pull up Google Earth or Google Maps and really zoom in around Easter Island, it looks like it could have been connected to land at some point. There's at least ridges that if there was some flood, maybe that used to be super low before, kind of like Sundaland or Doggerland or one of those. So I don't think it's impossible in the ancient past. I mean, I don't know how long ago, but I don't see it be. But to call it, like you said, to call it Lemuria when it could have just been some sort of a land bridge that early hominids or maybe even later and people were going back and forth. I guess I could see that, but
and we can't even know if when you go back 12,000 years, let's say, we don't know if any of the lands really had names, unless you've got a good solid way to trace back language and trace back terms, names. It's very hard to know what any land masses were called 12,000 years ago by the the indigenous peoples in each site, isn't it? I mean, who knows? Who knows what they called the UK back then, or what what the US would have been called? We just don't know, do we? I mean, so I don't think it's helpful. So I was putting like Lemuria or Mu or any of these, even Atlantis. I was thinking, that I'm wary. I think it's better in these topics. I'm to say that I believe that there was a lost land mass in Southeast Asia, or you believe there was a lost land mass in such and such, and it might correspond to some of the stories that refer to lands called such and such. But that I think if you say there was an Atlantis, then you still have to you're sort of really pitching yourself to that horse, and so I'm wary of that now.
The only thing about Atlantis though is that Solon went to Egypt, and I think he learned the story of Atlantis from an Egyptian priest called Sankis, and who knows how long the Egyptians had that knowledge too. Now, you're right, they could have created it, but I think that one holds a little bit more water than other ones in the sense that that name was preserved through a few different ancient civilizations. So I think that one's interesting. Now, they still could have created it, but at the same time, there is precedent, the Cretaeus and the Timaeus, and then it being passed on from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece. So who knows?
I think there's a clue, and I don't want to derail too much, because I know we're going to talk about other stuff, but I think there's a clue in the story, though, that this is not an accurate telling, because, they obviously were told that the ancient Greeks were at the heart of this story, and they fought bravely, and, but we know there was nothing that we could refer to as Greece back then. Again, we come to that problem, these names are thrown around, but there's no way that 12,000 years ago that the Greeks of Athens were fighting bravely against the Atlantic. It doesn't stack up.
Right.
So what you really have there is a kind of Chinese whispers where, to keep a story going, you put either the Egyptians were smart enough to know, well, how do we get these people to take this and keep it going? We'll put them into the mix, or the Greeks adapted it themselves to make it a story more about them. Which, if you're going to pass down a story to your later, future offspring, it makes sense that you're going to include some aspect of yourself. Otherwise, you're going to be like, why are we even carrying this story? It's not about us. You know what I mean? So I think we can understand why that is, but then it also reminds us that this isn't a 100% carbon copy accurate story being passed down, that the Greeks are suddenly involved at the heart of the story when it becomes a Greek story, right? Now, and I think that is a clue to us that this is there's a mechanism of handing it down, is that, either the teller or the person listening includes an aspect that will make it hyper relevant for those that it's being transferred to, so the story keeps on going. So, who knows what the accurate first telling of that story was, right? Because maybe the Egyptians got included into it by somebody else, so they passed the story down.
I think you're absolutely right.
You have to remember that stories change a little bit over time, or can be deliberately changed.
I think you're right, and I think that, and you make a good point. I think, though, when you look at it, it makes sense, because the Greeks did that with other things too. The Greeks went to Egypt; they learned metaphysics, they learned mathematics. Even Thales went there and was the first person to measure the height of the Great Pyramid as a Greek person. I'm sure the Egyptians obviously knew what they were doing, but and you look at stuff like that, and they're taking that knowledge back to their own civilization and saying, I'm sure that they gave credit to the people at the time. A lot of these philosophers, based on their philosophies, seemed like moral, ethical people. But at the same time, you're right. Everybody adds their own little spin, right? So it's a little bit of the game of telephone, and it's a little bit of maybe personal invention based off of inspiration as well. Maybe they added a little twist themselves. So that makes sense.
Well, I think it's true, because I think what is story for? That's another thing we thought about in more recent times, that we have to ask, what is the value? Because we have history sometimes for the sake of history, where we have this idea that you just need to, we need to know the past and you can learn from the past, or we have it just as an educational activity, that you have to have some history and some physics and so on. But if we're really thinking, what is a story for? Most of the time it's to inspire people, or it's to inform you something about the cohesive nature of your tribe or your group, or to explain away something you'd waste your time thinking on by having a quick answer, or there's some reason for that story, right? So I think that in these cases, a lot of time you have those stories to inspire people within your culture. So what's more inspiring than that we were the great warriors that fought bravely, and that's us. We're the brave Greeks, the great masters. That makes sense, because you're giving people these cohesive narratives that we're timeless, we stretch back into the past, and we've done all these great things, and story has to serve a purpose. And I don't think that we should look at oral histories as being a huge effort to tell absolutely pinpoint accurate narratives about the past. I think that they stuck around because they were serving purposes, like the indigenous Australian law. A lot of the time, the stories were to do with knowing where features were on the landscape. You had these like mind maps. So, the story might include all sorts of fantastical characters, but it was guiding you through the outback and stuff, to water holes and and out of mountain ranges without getting killed and stuff. That these stories, they were fun to listen to at the campfire, but they also served a purpose. And in other things, they would warn you about certain dangers or things you could eat, and So I think that we've kind of lost touch with the idea of history stories for purposes, other than just simply saying, we're doing to repeat the past if we haven't learned it, and that's about as far as we go with stories serving us. And I think that that's something perhaps that we have become a bit disconnected from, that is a bit too academic and dry. The idea of just we need to know exactly what chemical went into the pot shard. I don't think that's what history, the flavor of history should be about. That 100% accuracy on the story. I think it should be about, how does that story serve the culture? Why are we carrying it forward? Because there's a lot of history that won't be carried forward. No one knows everything that's happened, and you can't possibly learn everything that's happened. So it's always a selective process, isn't it? What do we carry forward and what do we just forget about?
Yeah, you make an interesting point. Actually, I agree with you. And so while we're on Egypt and Greece, Socrates was not a fan of writing things down, and everything we know about Socrates is from Plato. And, I guess Xenophon too. Xenophon just portrayed Socrates as kind of a wise old man, while you look at what Plato did, and he took that, and you look at the Republic and some of these dialogues, and they're unbelievable. They're still better than most literature we have today. So you could look at where from one aspect, the oral tradition, you're right, it kind of evolves. Maybe we need that again, because maybe the exact narrative is just a perspective in that moment in time, and it doesn't allow for any sort of flexibility or interpretation. It kind of just is what it is, right? So you make a good point, and I don't disagree with you.
And that sort of loops around in a way to this book, because again, when you look at creation stories, I mean, creation stories obviously range across the planet, but they also range within the what we call, I suppose, developed world, westernized nations, or whatever we want to call that we have a few different creation narratives as well. Because of course, if we look at the origins of all life on the planet, we have a story, right, an unproven story, a couple of different ones. One being that essentially, a deity manifested everything, created, there's a creation period, depending on what your background beliefs are, different deity or deities, but there's a kind of a magical creation story or stories. And then you also have, of course, in science, this preferred narrative of abiogenesis, that chemical and geological processes somehow produced the first simple life forms, perhaps from debris from comets containing organic matter, and then chemicals in a pool and lightning and whatever else. But that's a story too, and we know that is not something that is scientific in the sense that we can test it. I mean, any attempts to test that idea have failed. We've never been able to produce anything on the lines of life in a test tube, right? So it's not really testable. So it's not truly science.
Somebody, I believe it's Stanley Miller, did do tests, and it took like years for it to produce. Now, it didn't produce life in a test tube, but it did produce some building blocks, I know. But then there's people that argue that the test could have been flawed and it hasn't been recreated, and then you get into that whole thing, and then you even look at peer review.
It should be repeatable if it's science again.
So it's like, the thing about science I don't like is they put stuff out there saying theory, when it's really hypothesis, and it does need to be recreated and done and verified. And then you also, but then they only do that when it suits them. So when they see something that maybe they can't explain that is repeatable, let's say, let's just say somebody that smokes DMT, and every time they smoke DMT, they go into this alternate universe and they're experiencing these entities, and they can do it every single time or most times, and maybe even half the time they have breakthroughs. Well, that's repeatable. Something's going on. It might be subjective or anecdotal, but it's still real. So what does that say? That's the problem I have with all this stuff, is it's only applied to the outside objective reality, or if that even exists.
Yeah, and that's problematic. And the truth is as well, in some of these shared sort of psychical or altered state experiences, people are having communal experiences, right? So it's not always totally subjective in as much as it's only in one person, it's one person's account or experience, but that people doing the same, say taking ayahuasca together and then saying that we're all seeing beings standing around the edge of the fire, the same beings. I mean, so what about that then? Because that should be a problem for the materialistic reductionist, right? Because if you're saying it's entirely some kind of dream state, well, it's funny that you get sometimes a group 4 or 5 people they took the same thing and they're seeing the same visionary phenomena. They're seeing the same beings or the same serpent or whatever at the edge of the camp. What's that then? If that if kind of just dreaming, how come you'd all be having the same communal dream or hallucination, right? Because otherwise you start questioning again, what's reality? Is it a shared dream hallucination? How do you differ that? Because if you say 5 people are seeing a glowing serpent going along, and the same 5 people, they saw the bus that they came in, what's the real difference? Objective, it should be multiple people observing the same thing, reporting back in the same way. That's an objective reality.
Right.
Now, if there are 5 people also then say we all saw this glowing serpent, that's an objective reality of some sort, right? Whether it differs in nature or structure to the other one, fine, but you're still getting an account where these people are saying they're seeing the same thing, and that gets ignored a lot. And we've personally had those kind of experiences, collective experiences with San Pedro when we lived in Ecuador, where you do have the same phenomena going on for you. So I think there is a question mark there as well, that it's convenient for the skeptics to kind of say, oh, well, it's one person in their head. But okay, it's not always impossible. One person. It's often groups of people having overlapping experiences. Or, as you know, in the DMT experiment, the people going into these realms and reporting, even if it's individually, reporting seeing the same beings and stuff, in the same place and things like that. So what the heck is that? And again, that loops around.
One thing that everyone has in common who have these experiences, they all say to us, it feels more real than where we are when we come back out of that experience.
Yeah, the hyper-reality.
The hyper-reality feels more real, and this frequency that we're in every day feels a lot more denser, a lot more heavier, a lot more sluggish, and that the other one feels much more realistic to everyone that we've spoken to about these things.
So in terms of that hyper-real sort of feel to it, doesn't it? So then the question is, what is real? If you could say something feels more real, it's like, what is real? So again, being real or reality is subjective, because you can say there's some other state that feels more real, whatever real is, right?
Probably they're picking up also that there's probably less of a manipulative experience, because I think it's more a pure communion of some kind. So probably that's what they're picking up, and like where we are now, because things are so controlled and so saturated and so out of what they should be. If you go back to ancestral, as we were talking about before, the storytelling and the ideas of keeping like old traditions alive, that because we're so far away from it, when you step into that other situation with that other reality that feels more real, that's probably where you're linking into the old ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask you too, Danielle, do you think that when people see these entities, now people see different things. Some people see aliens, some people see religious figures, some people see just geometric loving patterns. Do you think that it's based on your own psyche and where you're at, or what's the filter? Like, because some people do see same things and then they see different things the next time, or they'll see aliens, but I'm sure it's not the same alien exactly as this other person. So do you think that these are external entities that are just all different, or do you think that it's our filter perceiving these things in different manners, almost like a Jacques Vallée, Passport to Magonia, or something along those lines?
Well, it could be a couple of things. I mean, one, it could be your belief system or what you sort of like have grown up with, any, kind of influence that you've had. The other thing is that in shamanic terms, like there's always a saying that each plant or each element is different that you consume or that you use to get yourself to that experience, and that the plant will only give you as much as you can handle. So it will never tip you over the edge where you can't handle a situation. So both, being like one being part of who you are, your belief system, the other one being part of a learning experience, combine that together and probably you will see what you're supposed to see at that moment. And that teaching for that moment will be very specific for you, and probably if there is a collective teaching, it could expand out to other people. But at the same time, I also think that with the way that that these entities contact us, they can appear to us in any form. So they've got that ability, as then you go into talking about like people that shapeshift, or beings that look different from this time to next time. So I mean, I think that they can sort of like change the way that they come to us or they appear to us. Some people might see aliens, other people might see angels, people might see God knows what, so it just depends on, what you're able to process, at the same time, how open you are, and then at the same time, the teaching at that specific moment.
And again, that sort of, I think, goes back to the fundamental, because again, if you're saying, is something a distinct alien being, or is it an aspect of us? I mean, then you end up back at that, well, what is the fundamental nature of reality? Because if the fundamental nature of reality is a unified field of consciousness, which in shamanic thinking and also in physics as well to some degree, you have that idea. It's not just an idea, really. It's very hard to not see it like that. I mean, if you go to the the subatomic, the quantum level, there's no real way to distinguish anything from anything else, right? So even saying anything and anything else, it becomes a bit meaningless, right? That we just have almost like an energy vibration, if you want, that there is no other thing. So then in these experiences, on one level, you can say that there are other beings in the same way that we can say there's other people here. But then we also know that in another sense, a deep sense, there's not really other people here because there's no point where we're not joined, right? If we look at the subatomic level, you can't tell my leg from the air around it or the desk that the table's on. Once you go down to that level, there is no way to tell anything in this perceived room apart. So therefore, I'm obviously connected to you and everyone listening to the show and to Danny. And, so that has to apply in that other reality too. So if we say, could they be an aspect of us that we're seeing, or could they be distinct aliens? It's like, well, yes and no and no, because again, I think a lot of these topics, it always depends on, well, do you want to look at it in the zoomed out view or the zoomed in view, right? And from an ultimate zoomed out perspective, then there's no other beings, there's no one else, there is just this seamless consciousness. I would say is the fundamental principle is an underlying consciousness. Now, for the materialists and the reductionists, they would say no, because consciousness comes from complex brains that have come out of this long process of evolution of matter. And okay, well, if you go down that route, then you lock yourself into a view. You have to say that. But then once you look again at that quantum reality, it's very hard to stick with that idea because what's it building out of? It's building out that oneness again. So I think it's inescapable in a way to end up at a point where you have to say that, yes, the beings are both you and something distinct at the same time. And you have to almost hold with a double think, right? And that's where I think most people go a bit insane with some of these topics and with the experiences, that you can have periods of breakdown and insanity are part of the shamanic law and the shamanic experience. Right. That obviously happens because some people don't recover in this lifetime. They have something so intense happens, or the setting is very wrong. The way things have been done are very wrong, and they will have a kind of break. It doesn't mean they won't be able to live the rest of their life in some sense of functioning, but they will carry that as a kind of a psychic damage, throughout the rest of their life because of grappling with that. It's hard to grapple with the idea that you are both the other and and yourself and all those ideas without especially having them directly happening now, because we can have a conversation about it on here. People can think, well, it sounds far out or it sounds true or whichever, but if you're in the experience and you have no choice but to know these things, then when you come back from the experience, you're not really going and coming anywhere, right? You're still your experience is a continual flow of your experience. So then you go back to the experience of your bedroom and being back to your daily self, right? But you now have that direct experience of knowing that you're also the other and the universe and these beings, and well, that's a lot to process in the contracted day-to-day mind. And I say it's not surprising that sometimes that's overwhelming and can take a lifetime to process.
Yeah, I mean, most of this stuff obviously kind of hovers around the hard problem of consciousness because the experts can't disprove anything because they don't know what's going on, and the people that are doing this kind of research and talking about these kinds of things feel like they have a better understanding of it because of, like you mentioned, like personal experience and actually having weird things happen. And for me, my thought is I've never had anything happen in like day-to-day, maybe a couple things in day-to-day consciousness that are really, really weird. I've talked about them on the show before, so I won't go into that. But most of the weird things that have happened have been in altered states, whether, psychedelic use or meditation, lucid dreaming. These are all ways to kind of escape. And you're right. Even if I tried to convey that to somebody, they're not going to know what the hell is going on. So, I mean, it's just we're at a point where I think we just have to get information out there, and then hopefully somebody will step up and maybe look at these things. And I know science doesn't like to speculate on things out there. So hopefully we start seeing some more scientists take some risks. That's that's the only thing I hope with science, is that we just see more people taking risks, because I think that when you push the boundaries, or you shoot a further shot, there's a better chance of maybe finding something in the middle, maybe not completely out there, but maybe halfway, that actually makes sense, that can be quantified or at least tested. So,
well, yeah, and look, and again, that loops back around to the book. I mean, this is both a story, there's a story at the heart of it. It's not just some sort of textbook, right? It's a story, it's a creation myth, right, that was got science with it, but it's also a creation myth that links to older creation myths. Stories of the Pleiades and beings coming here are not a new idea. It's not a new telling in that respect. That we have cultures all around the planet, Native Americans, people that have, indigenous Australians, the indigenous cultures in Southeast Asia. There's people in the jungles about the Amazon. So they will tell you about, an ancestral origin, even the Pleiades, or a link with divine beings from the Pleiades, visitors from the Pleiades. Right, this is an old mythology. Right, this is something that was almost, I would say, universal. The Sumerians depict the seven stars. They're the symbol of the goddess Ishtar. Who's a key player in their stories. They have this visitation story. Sounds like 7 beings. These Anunnaki with 7 ships. And all. Right. So this is a narrative that's really fundamental and fairly universal. Now,
was that Apkallu? Is there 7 Apkallu too? I think there is.
Yeah, the 7. Yes, it keeps popping up. You've obviously got there's 7 mermaids that lived at the site at Mecca, where now you have, obviously they transferred from the pagan belief systems across to Islam, but that site there was a lake or a stream which was just connected to 7 ladies in the water. I mean, there's 7, and these 7 mermaids you find depicted in indigenous Australian mythology. They're depicted as Pleiades ladies are having fish tails. The fish goddess is universal. You'll find even here where we are in Wales, that the lakes here have this fish goddess in them. And so these themes that we're touching on with our work, and topics that connect to them that we don't necessarily spend much time on or don't talk about at all in the book, but do connect, are really foundational for the human experience. I think if you were to take information from this book and you went back 12,000 years, maybe even 50, 60, 70,000, and you could communicate with the people, I wouldn't be surprised if you find them saying, "Oh yes, well, we know about the Pleiades. Oh, we know about the women in the water." These are some of the oldest narratives. I mean, because they're everywhere, and if somebody's everywhere, there's 2 options. There are 3. Either they have a common source that's very old, that goes back to when we, as modern humans, populated the world and carried our stories with us, right? Or somehow you have a kind of, people moving around, meeting each other later, learning from each other, picking up these stories from trade networks and all the rest of that, and this kind of diffusion idea, right? Or there is some way that this is spontaneously happening everywhere, which, whether that's just coming out of the human mind or is visitation from beings telling you the story. I mean, essentially you have three options there. But somehow these have become narratives that are basically universal. Also, now we are in a position to match science with them. And I've always thought, we are heading towards a point where science and spirituality have to kind of come back together, right? So part of this book is that as well, is that, you could just have the story. And in some respects, Valerie's book is that. It's offering you the story again in a repackaged form that would suit the open-minded, metaphysically inclined spiritual person, right? Because you could just read her book, not look at our research. And if you were open-minded to those topics, you'd probably go away quite happy and say, oh, wow, that's the story of what happened, how we were made. But in some respects, it's not different to going to church and being told, the God's made us in their image and etc. And, if you're happy with that, then you don't need any evidence, right? You're happy with it and you go home. Now, but for some people, neither of those scenarios are enough. You like the story and all the rest, but to take it deeply into yourself and to have meaning in a greater sense of instructing on who you are and maybe how you should be and where you're going, that you want some objective physical evidence. Well, this book brings those two paths together. Some very strange, metaphysical, psychical information or topics and ideas are discussed, but also with objective science, and quite a lot of objective science based on researchers that are respected academics. And it does those both. But I don't expect to then also include people that are rigid, materialistic, very hard-nosed, objective scientists, because you're probably not going to reach them with a story that has even a whisper of the mystical in it, right? So I understand that, but this is a kind of a middle way. So for people that are looking for a middle way, that's what this book is. If you want to go to one of those other, I guess you could say, the extremes where you don't feel you need any evidence, then, well, there's plenty of information out there from channelings or from religious texts. You don't need to then read a middle way book, I suppose, really. Right. And then on conversely, if you are so sure there's nothing beyond atoms and and physical material, then you're not going to read these kind of books either. So what we're doing is bridging the gap for those that prefer to have that gap bridged.
So when you look at your book, obviously we can talk a little bit more now about your hypothesis. So you have physical evidence, or these are what silica spheral or sphericals, or what is it exactly again?
Yeah, sure. It's it's a combination, but mostly silica. They are called tektites. Now there's, let me think. I think there's 4 tektite strewn fields, which are sites, large, wide distributed tektite sites where you have homogeneous material collectively across a fairly wide area. So it's from one event. Like either one object or one event. Now there's 4 of those in the world. So the first thing you get from that is that they are it's rare, right? Because the planet's been around for 4.6 billion years. There's all sorts of things have happened to it, but we only have 4 tektite strewn fields.
Okay.
Right. So if you think of it like that, first of all, there's something weird about all of them. Okay. Now, I don't go too much into the 3 of them, but I do briefly touch on one of the others, actually, which is the moldavite side, which I discussed very briefly, because moldavite is an interesting one because it's this greenstone that looks almost like a kind of what's the green jewel I'm thinking
emerald.
of? Yeah, it looks like a kind of emerald.
Or jade.
And the funny thing about that is it's linked with the grail. Some people call it the grail stone. And in fact, some of the grail stories say that it was a green stone or a cup made of green stone, right? And some of the Welsh stories, I think they're in, it actually just says it's a green stone, the grail. Now, also you have the emerald tablet stories, right? A green stone again.
Yeah.
Danny's had some experiences in her shamanic kind of journeys where she has seen emerald tablets under a site in Mexico. But this green stone theme repeats. And then you look and you have this strange green stone that is definitely related to an extraterrestrial event. I mean, there's no doubt on that. Science accepts that the creation story of that material involves an extraterrestrial event. Now, I don't necessarily mean an intelligent extraterrestrial event, but the source for it is something coming from out of this world that leads to this material. Now, whether you say it's an impact or crash or a ship explodes or whatever it is, this is extraterrestrial in some sense. And funnily enough, this material seems to be considered very important, and it's like the grail and information carrying material and all this. So you have a mythology around that site, that's in Bavaria, where you find this, the moldavite, Moldavia, Bavaria, Germany. Right now, that's a relatively small strewn field. I mean, anyone can look up on a map and they'll see the moldavite strewn field. Now, the one that I'm particularly interested in is the Australian one, which is, well, not just Australian, but the Australite strewn field, which is primarily Australian, but it actually stretches all the way from Antarctica up to southern China, with some indications that possibly some small spherules made all the way up to Tibet. So, I mean, we're talking about a vast area. I mean, the estimate is somewhere between 10 and 30% of the planet's surface has some amount of australite tektite. So, I mean, that has to kind of sink in for people. You think about the size of the planet, and then you think maybe 10, 20, 30% of it, it has some of this material. This is not a standard event. This is not like a normal event that's caused this, because we've had all kinds of impacts, right? And you don't know of any that have left debris scattered across 20% of the planet's surface. So
what about so there's no natural cause that you could find or think of that, no volcanic activity, ancient volcanic activity, ancient asteroid or meteor? There's nothing that of that could create this kind of these tektites?
Sure. The the two competing, when Western scientists, European scientists first discovered some of these in Australia, there was some thoughts that maybe they were man-made, having looked at other tektites elsewhere, not necessarily those, but they had thought at first that these tektites might be man-made, possibly from earlier studies of the ones in Moldova and so I'm not quite sure if it was from the Australian, but they had theorized that, but they realized that, after some analysis that no, that these were definitely not human-made. Then there was some speculation that they could be volcanic in origin. The Australites may have been from a volcanic process. That was carefully researched and eventually dismissed. So the two competing theories for the last few decades were that it was either there had been an impact on the moon and that a piece of lunar crust had sort of been melted and broken off, and that this debris had then traveled through space and had rained down on Earth. And then the competing theory to that was that no, an asteroid had hit somewhere in Southeast Asia and had somehow thrown off this colossal amount of debris that had then, fallen all across from Southeast Asia across to Australia and into Antarctica. Right? And those for decades have been the two leading hypotheses. And the reason why you've got two competing hypotheses there is because neither one explains all of the observed evidence, but each one can explain some of the observed evidence that the countering argument can't, right? And yet each of them also is left with anomalies that are not explained by either hypothesis. And so this is why this is an ongoing mystery. This has not been, academics do not consider this solved. You can see that now the favorite hypothesis is the impact theory. And the reason for that is because, more recently we've had the ability to analyze lunar materials, in more detail, and the australite tektite didn't mesh well with the known lunar rocks, right?
Right.
So obviously that severely weakened a lunar hypothesis. So the default was to say, well, then it must be the impact, right? Because you've only got two to play with, particularly if you are a skeptic of anything more, unusual than that, right? So you're left with a default that even though you know that your hypothesis can't explain the observed evidence, it becomes the theory because it's the only model now that tackles most of the evidence in an explainable way, right? And so you can say, well, we have this theory. There's a few bits we can't fit into it yet, but maybe we'll find a way to fit them in later. But this is the consensus theory. Now, why isn't it correct? I can tell you why it isn't correct. There's a few different things. There's something called I forgot this right. I think it's called I may have to check this, but I think it's Moore's law. But essentially, there's a law in terms of how you make glass, right? That when you make, if you want to have a homogeneous glass without much bubbles in it, right? It takes time. It takes time, a lot of heat, time to release those gases and to release these bubbles. And there's a particular processes you do to make clear glasses and stuff, right? And homogeneous glasses. And it takes some time with extreme heat. Now, with an impact, you don't have time. You have extreme heat and you have pressure and all of that. And of course, there's plenty to melt rock and turn it into these mineral glasses. But it doesn't mesh well with Moore's law that you would end up with this homogeneous material, which you see in these particular tektite strewn fields, not just in the australite side, but also in, we talked about already, the moldavite and stuff, that it does not mesh at all well with those quick flashbang kind of heating, because instead you have a very homogeneous material without much sort of bubbles of gas in it and stuff. And they said that with Moore's law that doesn't fit, and they said that it looks more like something that's been heated over time in the way that we heat glass. So that was a problem. And so then you have to say, well, how can the australite end up being this almost uniform material, which is about 75% to 80% silica with around 10 to 12% aluminium, and then a few other trace metals, I think it's got like iron and tungsten and a couple other metals in there, but very uniform. And it's all this kind of a very dark greeny brown glass. It looks black, but if you cut it into slices, it's a kind of greeny brown translucent material. Now, so it breaches one of the laws that we have of how these materials are created. Now, when they were looking a bit more into that, they also realized that if you have these particular shapes, which are called tektite buttons, which are unique to the australite strewn field. So this is when we start to separate away from any other tektites, because there is no other site that produces these. We just have them from the Australasian strewn field. And they are uniquely actually almost totally uniquely across the southern part of Australia, right? So even with this vast strewn field, you only find the tektite buttons there, and they look like the nose cone of a rocket ship or something. If you imagine them, very small, or like a bit like a button. That's why they call them buttons.
Okay.
But they're shaped aerodynamically, right? You can look at it and you can see this has come from space.
Okay.
So NASA scientists and stuff, examined it. They realized that they could see that they were shaped by aerodynamic forces, and they did also experimentation trying to recreate the shaping and how you do that, in an intense heat event and all the rest of it. And what they basically concluded was the only way that this could happen is if a large body was in orbit, and then it had a superheating event, pieces broke off, melted, hyperheated and turned into liquid, pooled into spheres, which obviously liquids do in vacuum. So they formed spheres, instantly froze, of course, again, the cold of space. So you have these glass spheres, and they said then they continued on in an orbit from the parent object, and they entered the atmosphere at a fairly shallow angle and went through prolonged heating, which you don't see in small pieces of debris, asteroid debris, stuff that comes straight down into the planet. What happens if you have something come straight down, it's superheated and the outside evaporates. Right. And you end up with, at most, a very, very thin layer of liquid around the core, around a cold core. So when they come down and pass through the atmosphere, so it's a very flash, because the speeds they're traveling at. So there's just an intense heating event. Now, it's just to explain something melting and running back and forming these button shapes. It says it can't be like that. It has to have had time to have melted and start to run back and form these button shapes. So they say it has to be on this decaying orbit from a parent body, right? So now you've got a problem, because you've got, well, hang on, that doesn't mesh at all with the idea of an impact at all, because now you're talking about something in orbit and a decaying orbit of the debris. And this is further followed up by how this australite is distributed, because a lot of the people who specialize in australite hunting, there's some very passionate people involved in this, and thanks to them I have some of the clues to this, but they've realized that you tend to find it in clusters. So you'd go out in the outback and you might find over several dozen meters or whatever, you'd find pieces of this material, but then maybe not find any for another 500 kilometers, right? Now that's very untypical of a splash form where something's hit and pushed debris out. You find the debris is just all flown out in a direction. You'd have it scattered along that.
How are these on the surface, or are these deep in the earth?
These are on the surface, and this is another thing that baffled people as well. That they're 780,000 years old. How come they're so often on the surface and look like they've been there from 5 minutes ago? Which is another thing that's baffled people for a long time. They said they can't be that old because they don't look weathered and worn. They're often not in a lower layer. That people just find them. They fear maybe they get washed down in stream beds.
Are they in areas where there's no wind or water erosion, or? In
some cases, in other cases, they're in places where you could argue erosion, and others not. And there was arguments over this that they can't be as old as people are saying they're on the surface. It doesn't make sense. Look at them; they look like they're unweathered. Now, if you think that some of these things maybe were still going around because they were in space, then they may not have been there long. And this is another issue that again, you can't posit that unless you're positing a strange answer to this problem.
Right.
Because if the material is up there from something that blew up, and some of it is still going round and is gradually in decaying orbits, right? You could have additional falls over thousands of years, right? There's some of that material. Although the event that caused it is 780,000 years old, it doesn't necessarily mean that it all fell that same day, right? So that's another interesting angle to that. But the point is, if you find this stuff in clusters, that meshes far better with what's called aerial bursts, where you have, and this is a geologist who's spent a long time on this topic, who points out that if you've got larger pieces of debris coming from an object that's kind of broken up in the atmosphere, that as some of those larger pieces come through, they will explode in like almost nuclear bomb type explosions. The material from those pieces, those larger pieces, will then blast down onto the ground. So you get then a cluster of debris, right? And then you might have another one breaks the atmosphere 1,000 kilometers away and explodes. And then suddenly you have the reason for why you find these things in clusters, because they're not being ejected out of a crater. They're coming down from exploding chunks.
Right.
And the same guy points out that when you get to Laos, where you find the end of this debris trail, where there's pieces that are 20 kilos in weight, right, big chunks, which would not go far from an impact site, He also found there that there was, this is kind of the clincher in some respects for the aerial burst argument, was he found that on one of the pieces from Muong Nong, there was, in Laos, that he found that there was welding between what would have been a cooled area of the tektite and a second piece that would have had to have come down hours later. He said it would have had to have fused with it hours later. It's clear that you have a cool piece, which then has hot material splash onto it. He says, again, he says, just by that luck of the draw, two of these, one aerial burst has already been cooling on the ground, and another one has come over hours later and exploded, and the material is fused with some of that on the ground. He said that's the clincher signature for aerial bursts. You know then that you're dealing with aerial bursts, right? That this is not just a standard impact event, right? So now you're seeing, hang on a minute. So the main hypothesis that everyone's going with, the evidence doesn't fit it well, right? You have all these problems which don't fit with it well. Also, you have the missing crater, and you touched on earlier that there's been a story about a crater being found, and that's correct. Just this, I think, is a few months ago, there was a big story. But bear in mind, this is kind of funny because this story has not been really known to the public for years, and I'd never heard of it. You know, when I got involved with this, and isn't it funny that after my book came out and I've been tackling this, suddenly a story comes out about the 780,000-year-old impact and the Australites, and you know, which has been quite funny to see, almost like the universe throwing a bit of a curveball there and bringing out the story. Because yes, I mean, the missing crater has been part of the mystery, because well, look, you should have a 40-kilometer diameter, I think it's 40-kilometer diameter crater somewhere in Southeast Asia, somewhere probably Laos or southern China, and it should be very young, you know, in terms of geology, 780,000 years old. You know, we find craters that are a billion years old, right? So this is very young, and this has been one of the mysteries. Where's the crater? Where's the crater? Now, there's a team that very recently have said that they think they may have found it, but there's problems with that. First of all, they found an anomaly, right, under rocks. They have not actually found, you know, a definitive crater. Right, it may be, and I suspect it probably could be a crater, but then there's a couple other problems that they have there. They don't seem to refer to. One of them being that it's far too small, because what they found is, I think, about 12 kilometers in diameter, right? And all the calculations suggest for this amount of material and for it to get all the way down to Antarctica, that you're dealing with something enormous, probably a couple of miles across, impacting at a colossal speed, and throwing this material into space, you know, and down again, and all this stuff to try and make it work. So now you're down to a 12-kilometer diameter crater. It's like, hang on a minute, that's nowhere near the calculations. And the second problem is, which they don't seem to be aware of, is that there are multiple impacts 780,000 years ago, which I'll come to separately because it's part of this story. But they seem to be blissfully unaware of this fact, that you have impacts of objects in Antarctica, in Central America, in Tasmania. So what I feel is that what they have found is a buried crater, but it does not fit with the Australites. It fits just as a possible lost crater, but it's small and it's unlikely to be at the center of this. And again, I'll come to, that's another connected bit which I have to tackle. I'll very quickly say, I mean, that in the information I do tackle this, because in Valerie's book, one of the things that this information suggested was that at the same time as the destruction of a craft in space, that 5 years later, there is a intelligent engineered event involving basically a bombarding of the planet by asteroids pulled in from the asteroid belt and used to bombard the planet, right? And from all sides. And now, when she wrote that book, and just bear this in mind, this was 2003, okay? Now, nobody knew anything about there being a bombardment of the planet. You know, you'd have thought, oh, well, you know, I'd have heard about that. You know, that's an extraordinary event. You know, we'd all know about it. They only discovered this in sort of 2015, 2016. It turns out that, yes, that 780,000 years ago, there was indeed a multi-directional bombardment, and not by one large object breaking up, which you'd think at first, because that might explain it. Turns out, no, the chemical composition of the different sites shows that these are different objects. Now you're getting to something weird, because you know, why would that happen? Because instead of having every 10,000 or 100,000 years, you know, you get one of these big objects hits. Now you're saying that at the same period that we've had this object breaking up in space, that you're also getting a bombardment of different asteroids suddenly coming from all directions and hitting our planet, as exactly as this intelligence has told someone, you know, exactly as they've told them. So this, what we see now being found at the moment, I suspect is one of the impact sites from this event. But the paper that these people have produced does not mention the fact that you have multiple impacts at that time. And I think that that's sloppy at best, to not even mention that hang on a minute, there's several impacts at that time. Why aren't we comparing that? Why aren't we mentioning that? And why don't they mention the fact that for years and years it's been calculated this would have to be at least a 40-kilometer diameter crater? So I understand that they want to solve the mystery, and there's kudos if you do that, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to play by the ball. You have to play by the rules, and you have to deal with the science and the physics of it. The crater, what they're talking about, is a crater that would not fit with this.
Right. I wanted to ask you too,
and all for the reasons I just gave you as well.
It
wouldn't explain aerial bursts. It wouldn't explain the tektite buttons down in southern Australia. It doesn't explain any of that.
Right. I wanted to ask you, what's the difference between these tektites and, like, let's say, the microspherules or microdiamonds and whatever that they're finding correlated to the Younger Dryas impact? I think it was at Kamenenki, I think is. So is there any commonality, or is there any, do you see any similarities? Because I know they are finding stuff and physical evidence of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure about terms. Composition would be different, I imagine, very different. I mean, as far as I know, only the tektites have these kind of levels of silica, this 70%. Other than that, I mean, I don't know much about the formation of the microspherules for the Younger Dryas impact events, to be honest. I don't really know the ins and outs of how that's done. All I can say is that, to my knowledge, there's no other,
right?
There's nothing produced like that with that level of silica. That makes them particularly unique. Yeah. And again, I don't know how homogeneous those microspherules are. Maybe they are fairly homogeneous. But yeah, in terms of these glasses, certainly the tektites are very unique. Again, I would have thought, being from the flash kind of explosion, there must be some kind of mixing of elements in some of those microspherules. I'm not sure, because I don't know the ins and outs of it. I can only speculate a little bit and say that they're definitely not from the same kind of processes.
Okay.
But obviously it related. Again, of course, you've got large heat events and pressure events and stuff. So I mean, there would be certainly some overlap. But yeah, I can't say enough to give them a proper contrasting.
I gotcha. Well, do you guys have an extra 10, 15 minutes? Can we do maybe like a little Patreon segment with you guys here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, hopefully that's given people an overview.
Yeah, I think that you did a great job explaining your hypothesis and then the physical evidence and stuff. Absolutely. And obviously we got to talk about some other interesting stuff as well. But yeah, so everybody go check out Exogenesis Hybrid Humans. It's on Amazon. It's available now. Is there anything else you want to plug or say?
Well, we have an upcoming short documentary version of some of the material in the book, and that should be done round about the middle of June. Okay. So if people want to keep an eye on my website, stuff, obviously I will promote that once it's up and ready.
Yeah, and I have the links to your website, and I have the links to the book down below. We appreciate your time and you coming back on, and we appreciate obviously your research and your obviously looking for physical evidence and trying to actually add some sort of scientific value to a subject that there's usually a lot of speculation but not really a lot of evidence. So but yeah, we appreciate it, and I started reading your book, look forward to finishing it, and keep doing your research, keep plugging away, and that's it. Everybody stay safe out there, and everybody love everybody. It's all about love and peace, people. That's all it's about. So
thank you very much for having us on. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniella. We appreciate you coming. It was fun to talk to you too. I know we haven't had you on yet, but maybe we can have you both on next time, and we can get into some more of that shamanic and esoteric stuff for sure.
Yeah, it'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yes, people can find Danny if they want readings or shamanic kind of services. That she has a website about DanielaFenton.com, so people can find her.
Okay, cool. And for anybody listening, we are going to finish this, and if you're interested in listening to a little bit more of our conversation, I'm going to be posting it probably on Patreon later. And again, everybody stay safe out there, and we love you. Peace.